Salam, Namaste, Eid Mubarak to all of you. Good morning, good evening from wherever you are joining us across the world. Welcome to our final episode, I feel like saying, because it almost seems like a soap opera, doesn't it? Our final installment in the Summer of ISHQ webinar series, which is the second edition that we are holding this year. And the Summer of ISHQ series was set up, and especially this year, to return to the center of our conversation, the very idea of ISHQ, the idea of debate, the idea of dissent, the idea of discussion, all of which in various ways has been marginalized in the world in which we live. And for our final session, we have picked the subject of fantasy. And we have posed to our two speakers for today a broad question for them to do with what they will. And that question is, what is the fantasy of sexuality? I will briefly introduce our speakers, each of whom will speak for 10 minutes. We'll just give opening remarks, after which I will curate a conversation between them for another 10 minutes. And at the end of which, the last 25 minutes or so, we will have questions from the audience. Speaking of which, please post your questions during the duration of the session in the Q&A box. And Shiv will curate the questions for us, and hopefully we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. And so let me begin by introducing our wonderful, fabulous speakers who are going to make everything all right in the world and worthwhile. And our first speaker for tonight is going to be Damon Young, who is Associate Professor of French and Film and Media at the University of California at Berkeley. And our second speaker this evening is going to be Dina Al-Kassim, who is Associate Professor of English and at the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So welcome, Damon and Dina. And Damon, we'll start with you. What is the fantasy of sexuality?
All right, thank you so much, Professor Madhavi Menon and Shiv Sharma and the others for inviting me to participate in this series that I've very much been enjoying. It's a pleasure to be here from our quite different time zones and to be in dialogue with Dina Al-Kassim. So what is the fantasy of sexuality? The question is stimulating in its polysemy, since it could mean several different things, but especially in its provocative, and I would even say perverse use of the definite article. What is the fantasy of sexuality, as if there is only one? Now, the other preposition in the question of also introduces ambiguities. The fantasy of sexuality. Does this mean that sexuality is itself a fantasy? And listening to some of the earlier talks in the series, that might be a colonial fantasy, the term sexuality, naming one of the apparatuses of a colonial European modernity that depended on the production of racialized figures in tandem with the concept of an interior self. And I'll return to that if I have time. Or if we grant that sexuality, in spite of its historicity, actually describes something fundamental in the experience of signifying beings, I think that's a psychoanalytic position that I basically hold to. The fantasy of sexuality might invoke something like a primal or a structuring fantasy that constitutes subjectivity, which could still be historical, okay? But say, for example, the Oedipal fantasy, whose activation and repression founds the subject in one version of Freud's theory, or maybe closer to my own sensibility, the idea that if we give something up in order to enter the domain of meaning, of signification, this is some sort of constitutive loss, always retrospectively posited, that will be filled with fantasy and that will orient the fantasies that in turn constitute us as subjects of a particular orientation and hold us attached to the world. And I'm kind of thinking here of Laurent Bellant's work on how fantasy keeps us tethered to a world that challenges that attachment at every turn. So in this sense, the fantasy of sexuality might be the fantasy of a redeemed loss, the fantasy of sexual connection, of an impossible sexual relation. And so what drives the relentlessly serial nature of desire, perhaps the hope of arriving at the object, finally reaching it, or, as in the Aristophanes myth, being reconnected with some missing part or even half. And in the same psychoanalytic perspective, but from a different angle, the question, in fact, is redundant because sexuality is fantasy. That is what makes it sexuality and constitutes its divergence from the mechanistic domain of biological need. So when need passes into demand, we have entered the realm of signification, and thus begins the psychic life of sexuality, a psychic life whose form is fantasy. So this is why Laplanche and Pontalis, the French psychoanalysts, say that fantasy is the fundamental object of psychoanalysis. To restate this perspective, again, which is kind of my own, I think, sexuality is fantasy. That is its mode of operation. But fantasy is not only where it appears. It escapes our attempts to pin it down. It disguises itself. It hides out in ellipses. It lurks in the domain of the unsaid, the unthought. It manifests in inverse and inverted forms. It contaminates speech, and it negativizes, or I would say virtualizes, what appears. So fantasy, I think, then is the insistence of the virtual within the actual. It's the mobility of our modes and forms of worlding. It's what prevents the real from falling into the mere repetition of the self same. To offer an example of this negativizing operation of fantasy and its constitutive link to sexuality, we can turn to Freud's much commented analysis of one particular fantasy structure in his famous essay, A Child is Being Beaten. So the title of the essay narrates a scene revealing that also that fantasy is theatrical. It is, as Laplanche and Pontalis put it, the mise en scène of desire. Okay, so it has this theatrical quality. To be brief, Freud says that this beating fantasy and the passive construction is being beaten is important to its very mobility. That fantasy is extremely common among, says Freud, those suffering from hysteria or obsessional neurosis, i.e., basically everyone in the bourgeois Viennese social world of his patients. So it seems to be a culturally pervasive fantasy, a daddy fantasy, as it turns out. But far from reductive, Freud's account proliferates multiplicities and is an attack on empiricism from the very beginning. So first he says that a lot of patients have this fantasy, whether they know it or not, okay? And it often only emerges in analysis. And so in this sense, fantasy is dependent on the mediation of speech and the analytic apparatus that solicits the speech, and I'll come back to that. Second, he says that though it sometimes takes the form of a neurotic fantasy, the patients turn out not to enjoy it at all when it becomes real, for example, when they see a classmate actually being beaten. And finally, Freud notes his surprise in discovering that the patients who develop this fantasy frequently come from the most loving households. And so the contemporary perspective that might see it as a kind of working through of trauma is inadequate. So the fantasy does not correspond to a real desire, nor to an actual experience of being beaten. It belies the reality of both the past and the present. And that's what's interesting about it to me. Now, without going much further down this path, I just want to mention that Freud tracks the fantasy back through several stages of latency, among which the crucial stage is necessarily repressed and can only ever be a speculative construction on the part of the analyst, and yet one that holds the whole analysis and the subject together. And that stage is I am being beaten by my father. So for Freud, sexuality is this process of mediation between what appears to consciousness and what must remain unconscious. And it's also this semiotic slippage between signs, from a child to some children, to me, to some boys, etc. And moreover, sexuality depends on this phantasmatic theatrical scene in which the subject is both strangely unmoored, but to whose kind of structure or syntax it is also anchored. Also important here is that the fantasy might be rejected by the very person or people in whom it is most active, and that the distinction between the sexual and the non-sexual remains necessarily unstable. So fantasy spans that indeterminate boundary around what the sexual even is. But I also want to say, echoing the discussion between Joseph Massad and Charu Gupta a few weeks ago in this series, that this whole complex is, of course, historical. Both the fantasy and the psychoanalytic apparatus that apprehends and perhaps generate it emerge alongside within a particular colonial context. marking a particular arrangement of the public and the private, a kind of historical form of social organization. And thus, we really need to speak of cultural fantasies. So while fantasy is particularizing, it's what feels most individual to me, it's never just mine. It is trans-subjective, it is subjectivizing, it is historical. And so I guess what Freud is describing in his brilliant attack on empiricism is a kind of phantasmatic structure of Western patriarchy. All right, so I'm coming to the end of my remarks, and I want to end with two brief points that I think are at the center of my own research projects. The first is that these cultural fantasies, which are always in some sense sexual fantasies, are political. They shape the horizons of the political. They are libidinal in ways that bear on collective experience. And we can look, for example, to the current mania around borders, the racialized, libidinized fear of immigration in, for example, Trump's America or contemporary Australia, which found new figures for its fantasy in COVID, allowing an activation of the fantasy of a walled-off nation, keeping contamination out, which is the current situation in the lock fortress Australia, where thousands of Australian citizens in India are currently unable to return. And we could make a connection here to what Klaus Taverleit once called male fantasies in relation to fascist Germany, a defensive fantasy structure around gender and sexual propriety linked to the eroticized fear of national and racial impurity. Okay, so again, this is to insist on the radical historicity of fantasy. And finally, most importantly in my current project, fantasy requires mediation. It's always mediated, which means it depends on its media forms. I guess the first would be speech. And here I'm thinking back to the recent discussion between Sam McBean and Rohit Dasgupta about how sex and technology mutually construct each other. So fantasy lives not only in its representations, its kind of image repertoires, but also in its media platforms. For example, in what Dipesh Chakrabarty shows about the construction of interiority in the modern colonial novel. Okay, so I'll leave it there. My current project's looking at some of those different mediated forms of subjectivity and fantasy from early modern writing to contemporary networked technologies.
Thanks so much, Damon, for that rich beginning with lots of directions in which we can go. And let's hear from Dina first before we follow some of those directions.
Thank you. I'd like to again echo Damon and thank Ashoka University and the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality for hosting the series, and especially to Shiv Sharma and Madhavi Menon for the communications beforehand, which were very warm and reassuring. And I'd like to underline that the format is refreshing and unique, but also for an academic a bit unsettling because we aren't to be reading from a written text. So these notes were my attempt to bring to light some examples of the three axes through which my work, I think, addresses the themes of sexuality and fantasy. And so I would begin by saying that my thinking on the topic of sexual fantasy knits between three axes: the psyche, power, and the multiplicity of practices in a comparative framework, or in comparative frameworks. And in my work, I look at sites in Africa and the Middle East, in Europe and North America. The deployment of sexuality as a biopolitical framework, thus, which is exercised through these three axes, virtualizes via fantasy structures alternative organizations of life and forecloses affective connection that run athwart normative models. So my work traces instances of foreclosure and the forms of imagination that manage to thrive in spaces of foreclosure. There is individuation in fantasy. There is the fantasy that is mine. Yet these nodal points are shot through, prefigured, shared, collective, and at the same time, mine and yet never mine. And this not only because of the ideological impositions that we track in post-colonial studies, but also because the psyche, to echo Laplanche, is the result of a depositing of enigma. So from the point of view of sexuality, thought through psychoanalysis and the biopolitical, which is to say that the administration of life and death, along with our strategies, not only for survival, but also for collective imagination, from this point of view, fantasy and sexuality are the threads with which domination and freedom are woven. For me, the coupling of the words sexuality and fantasy conjures a modernist cultural and political insight that desire and fantasy are foundational for political and social life, along with an understanding that comes much later in the 20th century that even our most intimate and subjective experiences are engendered by the ways that we are bound to and fostered by forces far exceeding our specific roles, identities, and determinations. So this means that the terms have specific genealogies and are embedded in the colonial and post-colonial political economies and histories that queer, feminist, and post-colonial thinkers have been working with in archives, but also in the more ephemeral texts of relation and collective imagination. So for instance, the global avant-garde literatures develop an archive of this insight into the unconscious structuring of social roles and power relations by fantasy and desire. The words sexuality and fantasy also conjure the violence of coloniality and the ways that colonial violence works on the register of fantasy to destroy the ability of its victims to recover and forget trauma, which is something we do via memorial practices, rituals, art practices, or practices that turn pain into symbols and into knowledge. Fantasy is another way of naming the eros of creativity. As an example, I will recall for us a vignette from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. In the course of elaborating the various types of psychic disorder produced by the very specific forms of violence he witnessed in the Algerian War of Independence from the French, Fanon presents us with the damaging and insurmountable, quote-unquote, injunction not to forget, suffered by one of his patients, an Algerian woman. A French soldier says to the woman whom he has raped, "If you ever see your husband again, do not forget to tell him what we did to you." Fanon claims that the patient was then unable to pass from remembering to forgetting, and so became possessed by fantasy, so that she was unable to distance herself and produce the past as a knowledge rather than a perpetual and tormenting fantasy. So here, fantasy and sexuality are engulfed by violence. For this reason, I found psychoanalysis to be an essential discourse for examining ideology and social fantasy, and in particular for uncovering the sexual charge that motivates or energizes social panics. And this is because psychoanalysis offers a vital storehouse of models and a lexicon to unravel cultural fantasies that are mobilized in populist, fascist, and national campaigns against sexual dissidents and religious and racial minorities. There is a playbook. It's a modernist playbook, and we can say that it comes from Europe. We can talk about this, but it is obviously manifest globally in so many different variations and iterations. A speculative practice, which we call theory, and a clinical practice, psychoanalysis is also a global formation for the simple reason that it developed coevally in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. And of course, there are parochial forms and institutions of psychoanalysis that are homophobic, that are racist, but this does not mean that psychoanalysis is a white or a Western science. So let's turn our lens from the perspective of a post-colonial scholar on this thing called the West. Generally, I find that claims about the homogeneity of the West, made from the point of view of the diversity of sexual practice in the global South, unconvincing. Because the sexual diversity of what gets called the West is thereby dematerialized and made to vanish, or assumed to be white and frankly neoliberal. In fact, communities of sexual dissidence and practice that do not align with stereotypes of cis heteropatriarchal normativity abound and have been exhaustively detailed in queer historiography, in literary and cultural criticism for decades. When it is assumed that the West is a unity rather than a contested space of power, in which we often lose. We risk repeating the kinds of erasure that post-colonial thinkers have criticized as Orientalism, primitivism, and racial thinking. Post-colonial thinking presents us with the ongoingness of coloniality. And as an example of the coupling of sexuality and national fantasy on the one hand, and the diversity that can be found even in the most sanctified of national symbolics, I'd like to refer to 4 photographs. So Shiv, could you project the photographs for us? All right, so I'm beginning with an iconic painting of the French nation state. This is Liberté, Leading the People, and painted by Delacroix. We're all very familiar with the national iconography of the bare-breasted Marianne, but we perhaps do not know that when the painting was first exhibited, the female figure was criticized for being bovine and hideous, filthy and reeking of prostitution. The leg posture criticized, Delacroix criticized for ineptitude in this painting. Most readings that I've encountered of the painting focus on the central figure and the male figure surrounding her, each representative of a different social class and social function. But I have run across very few, in fact only 2, readings of the foreground. So if you look at the foreground, you see 2 corpses, male, on the right, or on my right, a soldier lying there with his fly undone, his clothes open, and one barefoot. And on the other side, the figure of a naked male showing visible pubic hair, naked from the waist down, and his naked foot mirroring that of the soldier on the other side of the painting. Feminist readings of this painting understand that Delacroix has encrypted here an apocryphal story that of the actual figure model for the Marianne, and the apocryphal story is that a young woman or a woman realizes her brother has been taken from his bed and raped, and she wanders the streets looking for him, and is seen in torn petticoats because she herself has witnessed or been the object of great violence. So here the national symbolic, which is touted as a normative figure, has encrypted within it male rape, and the rape of a young man as an allegory of the French people. Could we see the next slide, please?
You know, we might need to rush through these though, because
rush these. Okay, here's an example of a reverse Marianne. This is a Muslim woman being forced to strip her coverings at the beach. Can we see the next, please? Next slide. This is a Canadian example of a Doukhobor woman. The Doukhobors were Russian immigrants to Canada who refused private property and citizenship, and they burned their own buildings rather than submit to the Canadian government's imposition. And the next one, this is the last one. I thought this might be interesting to you, Madhavi, from your writing on yoga and the way that yoga has been appropriated globally. This is the famous naked yoga woman somehow engaging in what she imagines to be a protest against racism last summer in Portland. So these are examples of, I think, the diversity of sexual fantasy in the West that is often excluded in our discussions.
Thank you, Dina. That was just fascinating, and I'm so sorry that we ran out of time because I could have listened to you forever. But we do have a lot more time to continue this conversation. And let me just sort of throw out a broad question that I think both of you touched on in really interesting ways, which is the relationship triangulating the relationship So it's not just sexuality and fantasy, but also the social or the political, and thinking about those three things together. And there were many sort of potentially worrying things that he was talking about, but it might boil down to the idea that there seems to be some appropriative relation to fascism in the fantasy of sexuality. That in fact, all these sort of national allegories to which Dina referred, all of them have some idea, for instance, of a certain kind of heterosexualizing female figure. And there's this sort of relationship to fantasy that is presented as real. And just sort of speaking in terms of India, the Indian state is also figured as a mother, of course. And so she's at one and the same time engendered feminine, but also removed from the realm of the sexual, because she's meant to be, in the realm of the mother. And so I just wondered, and I'd love to hear both your thoughts about that sort of national allegorization of sexuality, what that has to do with fascism, and whether you would conclude then that all these fantasies are in the service of a certain kind of political conservatism. And either of you, please.
I could start to give Damon a moment. I guess I would point to a very old essay by Georges Bataille called The Psychological Structures of Fascism, where he argues, following Freud, that for him the most intolerable thing about fascism is not all the violence, it's the fact that the fascist exports, he says, exports their violence to the outside, right? Rather than tolerate it and work it through, they scapegoat, they racialize, they engage in social panics of this kind. And I think that this is a structure of fantasy that is social and that has a history coming from Europe, that has been appropriated and adopted, I could say, or at least has found fertile ground when the seeds have landed elsewhere. Elsewhere, why? Because of the necessity or the imposition of the nation state as a social form and as an economic form. So we could take this into discussions of capitalism, of globalization, of coloniality, but we could also, as Damon's presentation was suggesting, focus on the subjectivity of local instances or even particular texts and so on.
Right. Damon?
Thank you, Dina and Madhavi, for the question. It is a troubling way that you put that, the suggestion that because of the link between fantasy and the social, which we both were highlighting, insofar as the subject is also socially constructed and fantasy is part of that formation, that therefore there's a link between kind of a national allegory that tends towards fascism. I'm alarmed at the way that you put it, and I was just thinking as Dina was speaking, it does seem to me that national allegory is basically conservative in its nature, because the fantasy of the nation is a conservative fantasy, and I guess at its limit a fascist fantasy when it becomes hypertrophic, because it's always the delimitation of an us from an outside, and therefore we're threatened by what's outside. And it's true that we both, from both of our presentations, suggested that fascism is libidinal. It draws on a libidinal energy that is both, it taps into, subjectivizing, but is also collective. Just think of Freud's group psychology, but there's many texts that illustrate this. And so, but I guess I don't think that means that fantasy has to be fascist. But the question would be, what are fantasies of collectivity, and practices of collective fantasy that would not be anchored to the fantasy of the nation, which I think is ultimately fascist, or would not serve a fascist project? Are there other ways in which collective life can be imagined, is shot through with fantasy and even eros and libido, that doesn't easily lend itself to this kind of conservative or fascist reappropriation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, sorry, please go ahead, Dina.
Of course, which is why I think we both began with the, well, I'll use a clunky word here, the dialectic of fantasy, right? That there is no outside of it, in a sense, although one doesn't want to ignore material reality. But to work from the traditions that we've been working in, I don't see that it is easy. I do not think it is easy to create a barrier between, say, happy fantasy and evil fantasy, or personal, invested, libidinal activities, from music to food, all of which require this investment of fantasy. A distinction between that and the morbific that we're discussing, and so. The interest of the term fantasy is that it forces us ethically to knit between these aspects of our thinking and our examples. Of course, not all fantasy is fascist, but in that last photograph of the nude woman, white woman, very privileged, whatever her social class, right, thinks that by exposing her vagina at the police, that's a powerful fantasy that from an external perspective might look like a very sort of ineffectual or self-indulgent or unknowing of its context, right? Unaware of all of the other loads of historical fantasy that prefigure it and that are framing it. But of course, psychoanalysis allows us to look at more delicate examples.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And before we move to Shiv, who's curated questions from the audience, just to sort of throw out a comment based on what both of you just said so wonderfully, which is that if we think, and we do tend to think, of sexuality or discourses of sexuality as being somehow liberatory, as being somehow sort of enabling and empowering, it is, to say the least, sobering to think about that our fantasy of sexuality as liberatory, in bed with, as it were, the idea of fantasy as always being conservative, or and does that make us think of sexuality as the conservation of an individual? So you can sort of allegorize it as the nation state, but you can also individualize it as the self-sufficient human being whose access to a certain kind of sexual identity provides them with this notion of me, not you, right? Because as Damon said, that's the fantasy of the national allegory, me, not you. Here's the border that is going to keep you out, which of course is what also makes the individual. And so, just a thought that was inspired by what both of you said. But Shiv, please, let's start with the audience questions, since I don't want to eat into more of their time. And Damon and Dina, I'm sure you respond to that comment at some point, should you so desire. But Shiv, all yours.
Thank you both for such rich remarks. The first question is actually kind of going back to the question again and the basics that we covered in asking whether there is a distinction that could be made between sex and sexuality, or are they interchangeable in the realm of fantasy? So how would you think around that? And either of you could start on
that. A distinction between sex and sexuality?
Yes.
Dina, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. If the question is implying that there's a distinction between sex acts and the realm of sexuality, which would encompass fantasy, senses, affects, taboos, right? A sort of broader social structure, you could say, although it's not really a structure. It's more like a constellation. I would say, yes, we tend to make that distinction, and we tend to blur it at the same time. And it's that doubleness that can be, for some, a real incitement to desire, exciting, and yet is also can be very terrifying, right? It can be the ground of social panic. So they're always going to be in relation. That's what I would have to say off the cuff. How about you, Damon?
No, I think that's helpful. I guess I mean, so if sex refers to sex acts, I suppose. I mean, it also, of course, refers to the idea of biological sex, which then is in its own
Yeah.
relation to gender, whether it's, you know, seen as different or linked. But of course, sexuality is a larger analytic, which, as Dina just said, does not only encompass either biological sex or sex acts, kind of narrowly defined, but also, I mean, in my presentation, I suggested that sexuality is fantasy, and fantasy is subjectivation. This also is echoing your own work, Dina. So therefore, sexuality, in a way, in a sense, is a way of describing the subject as it's produced in this fantasy structure that we call the social. So I guess in that sense, it's a much broader perspective. I mean, we could talk about the Foucauldian dispositif as well, but I think we should leave it there.
Thank you so much. The next question from the audience asks, what are the challenges to recovering or discovering fantasy and or sexuality, to upset the reductive one West, one fantasy model that you both kind of spoke to? And the person is also asking, this might be a broader question about the relationship between psychoanalysis and reading, if you might want to respond to that.
What are the obstacles to discovering or recovering the? Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, what are the challenges to recovering or discovering fantasy and or sexuality?
Well, it sounds illegal what you're saying, Torin. We can't discover sexuality for an academic context, so we'll be thrown in jail these days. Sorry to joke.
Can I just say something? I don't know what the answer is, but I'm hearing a resonance with what Madhavi said a little earlier, which again took me by surprise or caught me off guard when you talked about the kind of fantasy of sexuality as something liberatory to which we hinge our optimism, you know, our hopes for a better way of being, you know. And in this question, I'm hearing a little resonance of that. You know, what are the challenges to discovering or recovering fantasy and sexuality as something that would be other than the kind of reductive or even fascist things that we're echoing in our presentations? There's a hope there that sexuality and fantasy can, in a sense, be sites of creative liberation. And yeah, I just want to hold the question around that. I don't actually, I mean, obviously I think they can, you know, in my life and in my work, I'm committed to the production of queer, non-normative, minoritarian forms of being and fantasizing. But I also hear Madhavi's caution about the fantasy of liberation through, like, the fantasy of an escape, I suppose. That's a pessimistic spin on the question. But Dina, I'm sure you have something else to add.
Well, I mean, I think one of the difficulties for us these days is that we can no longer, to quote Adorno, mount our image of freedom without criticism, right? We have to, there are quotation marks around our desire for revolutionary change and our hope for collectivity. So I think we need to understand the historical moment as one where that qualification around a desire for escape or a different world is produced very doggedly, very deliberately, right? Previously, we had been very invested on a sort of unconscious formation of political power, but we're living in a moment where there is quite a deliberate agenda. There's a playbook. We notice the similarities from nation to nation, and the challenge is, how do we inherit a revolutionary tradition while also being open to other forms of life that have been persevering all along? And from a Canadian context, we have the presence and pressure of Indigenous imagination. From a Middle Eastern context, we have the persistent ethical beacon, I would say, of Palestinian resistance. So we are not without material for thinking and for loving and for hoping, but the question does actually prompt us to consider the limitations, right? And to navigate between them. I don't have a very specific answer, though.
I mean, just to sort of go back to what Damon said at the very beginning of his opening remarks, what would happen if we were to replace the definite article "the" with something much more fluid and open? And, you know, so if there isn't a constant seeking after wholeness, whether you're conservative or radical, what difference would that do? And, you know, one could argue that the conservative strand is addicted to wholeness, I mean, or the fantasy of wholeness. So there is nothing but the definite article there. And so the onus lies maybe on us who think of ourselves as as occupying different fields, to perhaps let go of our hold on the definite article, you know, as a project.
Yeah, brilliant. That's brilliant. I love that.
So our next question is what takes us back to, Damon, what you had remarked in the passing about fantasies being mediated. So in that relation, how does cinema mediate the relationship between fantasy and sexuality? And either of you could begin again.
Sure, it's a question we can both speak to. And it's also a big question. So I'm trying to think how to curtail my response. I mean, in my current work, I'm trying to look at how different media forms generate and support different forms of subjectivation, sort of self-creating, but also therefore different kinds of fantasy. And so we can see in the kind of written diary of the 18th century and the emergence of modern autobiographies, the production of a kind of fantasy domain that looks something like the unconscious that will then become a certain subject of a version of modernity. So in cinema, we're in an image world, right? We're already outside the domain of the written text, and we're in a relationship to the imaginary in the sense of images. I guess I would say there's probably a different structure of fantasy that emerges there. And I think in the 20th century, cultural fantasies are shaped maybe even primarily in many places through cinema as a kind of dominant media form. And I guess those you could therefore study films as expressive of cultural fantasies or individual fantasies, both in what they represent and in what they fail to represent, you know, in the kind of gaps and elisions and repressions within the film text. Certainly the study of classical Hollywood cinema is full of those elisions in which fantasy dwells. Or you could look at the apparatus itself in the way that it positions a spectator at the center of a world that's represented for its view. And I think I want to do both, look at both the domain of representation and the apparatus itself as a structure.
Dina, would you like to?
Well, you know, I think the question of the positioning of the viewer is interesting, because it is a mode of address, right, that we could articulate, you know, we could produce a nosology of this mode of address, basically. And I think that the image, for me, of the two nude white women from behind that I showed, the Doukhobor woman, which is she's obviously posed for this photograph, right? The Doukhobors walked naked, whole communities, from the elders to the children, through these Canadian villages to protest property and citizenship. And yet that photograph is staged for posterity and for the newspaper. It's not staged by her. Whereas the last image, it seems to me you've got a kind of neoliberal subjectivity, subjectivizing itself before the global gaze. Look at me, I am a naked yoga woman. Now, I really don't want to denounce this woman. I'm talking about the image. She may be lovely, right? So, and you know, so I have to ask, what has feminism done to produce this idea that naked exposure is somehow an address to the police, right? To police brutality. Those of us who work in other countries or other contexts know well the error of this way of thinking.
And then also to tie that to that other photograph of yours on the beach in Nice, Dina, how white covering up is seen as somehow the I don't know, regressive. I mean, there's an entire sexual fantasy there, of course, that we haven't even got into.
Right? Of the state and its police, that it must enforce a certain image of femininity.
Exactly.
So the next question is actually going back to a lot of things you were saying in relation to violence. And this is, how do we reconcile fantasies grounded in sexual violation? And that includes even BDSM practices to more extreme forms of sexuality. But how do we reconcile that with the idea of sexual justice in the era defined by the politics of Me Too? And Damon, Dina, whoever would like to begin on that question.
This is a tough question. How do you, so how do you reconcile the fantasy of sexual violation? You mentioned BDSM, which is, of course, a form of sexual practice that is, in fact, consensual, I would say. So BDSM is already bracketed within a framework of consent. So I guess in that sense, you can reconcile it with the paradigm of sexual justice that shapes the Me Too discourse. I don't think that BDSM is incompatible with sexual justice at all, insofar as it is explicitly based on all the partners consenting to what happens. But I do think that sexual fantasy poses problems to the paradigm of sexuality that has taken root in and found expression in the Me Too movement. And this comes back to, I'm in favor of the Me Too movement. I'm in favor of anti-patriarchal struggle and sexual justice. But Madhavi mentioned before the kind of fantasy of individual autonomy, which grounds that discourse of consent in some sense, that you would know what you want, that's always a clear-cut thing, that you can communicate it in clear-cut ways, that you can receive it in clear-cut ways, and that sexuality can always be this negotiation between rational equals that really is at odds, I think, with a lot of fantasy. So the unconscious kind of returns to trouble the scene of that liberal exchange. So I think there's a problem there for the Me Too movement. There's a problem there maybe for our conceptions of sexual justice that are limited by the framework of liberal individualism. And again, which Madhavi very intriguingly tied to the fantasy of national integrity and national autonomy. Maybe we should let fantasy re-enter the scene of that analysis to ask what other framework there would be, what other way there might be for conceiving of sexual justice that isn't necessarily tethered to an individualist notion of affirmative volitional autonomy and consent. I realize it's a provocative thing to say, but that's what I'm thinking at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. And what you're putting your finger on is that social justice movements like Me Too, there are others, center themselves in sovereignty in ways that are destructive, both to themselves and to their potentiality. When we adopt human rights and property, i.e. sovereignty, liberal sovereignty, as our only ethical modality, we are sacrificing, and I say that word on Eid al-Adha, the feast of the sacrifice, we are sacrificing a whole potential of fantasy in order to invest ourselves in a fantasy that has a long history in law. Which I think, Madhavi, your work is tending toward, right? So purity and sovereignty become the basis of sexual policing, and a whole realm of biopolitical legal exclusion and structure. And it is true that there is a liberatory element in queer, I mean, the ethical work that queer theory does and queer studies does requires that liberatory fantasy, but it is also the case, as Damon was saying, that, for instance, BDS is not, is a play space. It's a space of fantasy as creative, even if it's not our own fantasy, right? And where different positions and relations of rule and dominance can be explored and perhaps exorcised.
So our next question, I think, perhaps has the ring of Lauren Berlant's work. It is the fantasy of sexuality that which attaches us to the world, or can fantasy also be that which makes the world unbearable for us? And I think we are just kind of going in that direction too, so either of you to start.
Who did you ask to start? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you say is the fantasy of sexuality that which makes attaches us to the world, or is it just fantasy?
That can also make us detached from the world, makes the world unbearable for us.
Yes, that's a very Lauren Berlantian question, and I like it very much for that very reason. I mean, I think the answer is both, of course, so that impossible paradox is what we experience as sexuality. Fantasy, and again, I'm thinking of Lauren's work here, but fantasy is what keeps us attached to the world, to our projects, to our ways of living, our ways of continuing under conditions which might not lead to our thriving. But I guess I think fantasy is also what's unbearable, what's unassimilable within our frameworks, what troubles our commitments to particular forms of sovereignty, individuality, particular fantasies of equality, and certain normative structures of relationality. Fantasy is always there troubling those things. I mean, that's why for a long time, homosexual desire, as Guy Hockingham put it, was like what couldn't appear within the scene of normative liberal society. Haunted that scene, and then it's a fantasy that can be both individual and collective. The fantasy of homosexual desire is always there troubling the scene. He was writing in the 70s. I'm drifting a bit, but so I think that fantasy and sexuality are those things that can make our relationship to the world unbearable, but they're also those things that anchor our subjectivity and thus anchor our orientation, our opening on to the world at the same time.
I would introduce a technical distinction that might be helpful, and that is the word sublimation. The kinds of fantasies of hope or cruel optimism that Lauren Berlant was exploring are social forms of sublimation that she delicately, she unfolded how sticky these honey traps are, right? To hope that you will get X, that you will achieve Y, even though the material conditions every day tell you that you will not, is not a fantasy that is engendered necessarily or even at all by the individual, but are the templates of living that are received. And what I see in her work as the liberatory potential is to begin to contain those social forms of sublimation, to contain them, but also to break them up, i.e. to unbind them and open them to the painful possibility that there are really other alternatives. In our mediatic world, as Damon was saying earlier, we're flooded with these images of life, of the good life, but also of terror. And calibrating our connection and our boundedness by those unconscious sometimes images is key. So getting out of the opposition between liberation and total domination in our thinking is one of the potentials that some of the queer work, for instance, Lauren Berlant's, can show, can guide us in this enterprise.
Yeah. I think maybe we have time for one quickie at the end.
Right. So this last question goes back to the question of gender. And Damon, you also said something about, the fantasy of fascism is described as a male fantasy. So the question is fantasy gendered insofar as that we can say there is a female fantasy that is different from what we can call as male fantasy?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are female fascists, so let's not forget.
I would want to say that gender is a fantasy. That gender is part of our fantasy structure. Our fantasy expresses itself as gender, as a form of self-making that's never adequate to itself. And in that sense, fantasy is absolutely gendered. Although I would not want to say that there's some essential female fantasy or male fantasy. But I do think that the fascist fantasy, insofar as it's a fantasy of national strength, is tethered to an imaginary of masculinity, which therefore makes it a gendered fantasy. Even yes, there are fascists as well.
A gendered fantasy that, except in the case of Germany, still insists on calling the land the motherland, which is just such an interesting pronomial displacement that that is just interesting to think about. Dina, were you going to add anything?
Well, I was just going to remind us of Delacroix's painting.
Yeah.
Not a case of fascism, but certainly monarchy in peril. To underline that, I think what we can agree on is that national fantasies attempt to install this familial narrative or structure and to adapt it to local instances. And so certainly in the Middle East, I'm not saying that this is a fascist fantasy, but it is a national one. We have in Egypt, there is a form of statuary, statues that are the mother of Egypt, and usually very modernist, very influenced by Diego Ribera, really bearing the traces of this history that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. That's great, and that brings us right to time. Thank you, Shiv, for the questions. But huge thanks to both Dina and Damon for such a provocative, productive, fantastic, in every sense of that word, conversation this evening. And just to sort of thank you for opening up so many different realms of thought. There's so many different provocations that have been offered here in the questions and by both of you. And I'd like to thank you both for that. I think this is a fabulous way with which to end our Summer of ISHQ series this summer. And of course, we'll be back next summer, maybe even again with Damon and Dina, and pick up like we had never left. But thanks very much to both of you and to all of you who've attended. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
very, very illuminating and fun to watch and participate.
Right.